Hi, I'm Will Bruin, and I was just recognized as a Seattle Sounders legend. Now I get to do voice reads for the Sounder at Heart podcast network.
This episode of Nos Arietes is sponsored by Full Pull Wines, a Seattle-based wine retailer and proud sponsor of Nos Arietes since 2011. Full Pull was founded in 2009, is based in Seattle, and is owned and operated by longtime Sounders supporters. They offer the best boutique wines of the world to members of their mailing list, with special focus on their home, the Pacific Northwest.
Here we go. Come on! Hey, O'Shan! Let's go!
A save by Fry! The Seattle Sounders have done it! MLS Cup winners!
Here comes Ray Diaz through the middle to crown it for Seattle! And now they truly can start the celebrations. It's the Sounders MLS Cup.
Nico Ladero leaves absolutely no doubt! The Sounders rule the region!
Seattle Sounders is good.
It's gone! They've scored! Finally!
This feels fucking awesome.
This is a tiny dog.
We want to win. It's Seattle Sounders, bro.
You know, what was the thought process in terms of who you decided to use and who you didn't?
Ever since Sounder Hart wrote a commentary that we didn't take Open Cup seriously.
Welcome back to another episode of Nos Arietes, sponsored by Full Pull Wines and the Sounder at Heart subscribers. We're recording on Tuesday, July 23rd, 2024. I am Jeremiah Shan. I'm joined by my special co-host, Mark Kastner, as well as our engineer, Lickett. Well, we wanted a test and we got one. Unfortunately, it's hard to escape the reality that the Sounders failed it pretty badly, falling 3-0 to LAFC on Saturday. I think the scoreline was probably a little unfair as the Sounders generated several good scoring chances, had a legit penalty shout waved off, and gave up 2 goals they probably shouldn't have, but they were very obviously second best either way. The Sounders are now 0-5-5 against the 6 teams ahead of them in the West, which certainly suggests they have a ways to go before they measure up to those teams. Still, they are in 7th as we head into the League's Cup. I still don't know if we have answers to a lot of our big questions, Mark, but how would you assess the overall picture as we sort of take a breath here and restock everything that's been going on?
Yeah, I think I feel a little bit calmer about everything than I would say probably a majority of our listeners and the readers on the site. But I like completely understand and then even relate to a lot of the frustration I'm seeing.
Yeah.
You know, I think we all want, like you started off with, we wanted to see this Sounders team up against a test. And contextually speaking, there's not a bigger test that the Sounders can face right now than LAFC, especially an LAFC team that's coming off being embarrassed a week ago on their home field against the team that beat them in the MLS Cup Finals. So Columbus Crew. So yeah, you know, I admittedly I was feeling like pretty positive heading into this match, and you know, that kind of went away in the first 10 minutes with that or 15, I guess it was probably like first 15 minutes, yeah, with the penalty. And I just kind of feel like that just like sort of set the tone for the rest of the match. That like there was a lot of confusion and blame to go around on a penalty, and then if you look at how the Sounders played after that, there was a lot of confusion and finger pointing and sort of like yelling at each other. And you just like look at a passing map from the 90 minutes of the game, and it was just the Sounders team that didn't have any idea of what to do. And yeah, luck is definitely part of it. I'm sure we'll kind of end up talking about that, but you also make your own luck, and they didn't. So
Yeah.
I don't like everything I feel about the rest of the season. Nothing changes. I think that this is a team that is capable of producing special moments. I don't think they're an elite team. I don't think they're going to go on a pace from here on out that's like Supporter Shield level winning talent or team or anything. But I think that they're a team that can potentially produce really special moments. We've seen it happen so far this season. They've had comebacks, and they've had solid wins and whatnot. They're in a semifinal of a competition, which doesn't happen without being able to create moments. So I think ultimately we learned a lot about what they're not, maybe. And then, I'm just kind of like, well, you got to kind of dust yourself off and see where you are, because a game in July hopefully doesn't define the season.
Yeah, you'd like to think that it doesn't define the season, but it is worth digging into it. So I think what's really frustrating about this game is I think two things can be true, right? Or maybe multiple things can be true. One, that 3-0 scoreline, I think is unfair. I didn't think this read as a 3-0 loss to me. If they had gotten one of those goals, they had a bunch of great chances at the end of the game. If one of those goes in, 3-1 feels somehow more indicative of what we actually saw. But put that aside, I think you have to look. I think either way, they were not as good as LAFC. They certainly weren't as good as LAFC in the big moments, and that's really what has defined, as you've pointed out repeatedly, the sort of what's defined this team this year is that they've been how they perform in these big moments. But I think the bigger picture is they haven't beaten LAFC in their last 8 games now. And not a lot of those 8 games where the Sounders dominated, but there's a pretty clear pattern at this point that LAFC just seems to know how to beat the Sounders. And, hopefully that changes in the Open Cup. But then I don't even know if that's how much that we can really take away from that, even if they do. But there's just something that LAFC is doing to the Sounders, and that really coincides pretty much with Steve Cherundolo taking over the team, that the Sounders have not figured out at all.
Yeah, and I'm so hesitant to say it's one thing.
Yeah, it's right.
But really, you got to kind of, I think there's a lens to look through, and it's what they've done with their roster since all of those games have happened.
Which is very little.
The Sounders have done practically nothing, and LAFC have been incredibly resourceful and creative with their signings. Like Carlos Vela is not on the team anymore, which is a huge deal. Obviously, Nicolas Lodeiro is not on the team anymore for the Sounders, which is also a huge deal. They don't really miss Carlos Vela at all because they have Denny Bouanga on their team, and they there was kind of a there was a crossover in their existence. And then they've just gotten they've gotten creative with their signings. Like the LAFC team that the Sounders played on Saturday night was missing probably 4 or 5 starters. Here or there, they changed up their formation and stuff. And Kai Kamara comes off the bench for them. And the Sounders could have conceivably gotten Kai Kamara as like a stopgap.
Sure.
But it doesn't matter. Like what's happening is LAFC is just kind of like plugging gaps here as they go,
Well, yeah, I was gonna say, I think a stat that sort of illustrates the difference between these two teams pretty effectively is, you go back to 2018. That's the year that LAFC came into the league. They have 0 players left over from that roster build, unless, depending on how you count Edward Atueso, who left and came back.
Yeah,
but they've had no players that have been with them continuously in that time. The Sounders have 6 players on their team. And I think that speaks somewhat to the philosophy differences of the Sounders and LAFC, whereas LAFC is more than happy to churn through players, whereas the Sounders are a little bit more stable. And I'm not saying that one of those is correct and one of those is wrong, but it does fairly illustrate, like the Sounders have been a pretty, and I think if you go back to 2022, like the beginning of this stretch of games that we're talking about with where the Sounders haven't beaten LAFC, I think you're going to find even starker differences. I guess I could have done the research on that, but the Sounders have not changed their roster almost at all, whereas LAFC is constantly adding pieces, letting pieces go, making tough decisions. In some degree, they let Chicho Arango go. They sold him for a decent amount of money, but that was maybe that was the wrong choice. Maybe it was the right choice, but it's more fits into a broader systemic way that they they deal with their roster. And I don't think I want to see the Sounders changing over quite that much, but somewhere in the middle would be nice.
Yeah, like any changeover
Right.
would be nice.
I mean, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, it's like it's definitely somewhere in between. It's definitely at the very least, LAFC is proactive about their roster, and the Sounders aren't any active. They're not even reactive.
Right. Yeah. They they made some moves this offseason. The only real significant one was Pedro de la Vega. He was the only player. I guess Masovsky also played in this game. So they had two guys that they signed this offseason that at least got on the field in this game. But something else you mentioned that won't necessarily make for good radio or podcasting, but I did want to bring it up because I'm looking at it right now. You mentioned the Sounders passing map from this game, and I think it does illustrate sort of the struggles that they had pretty well. It is so narrow and bunched up. It's essentially everyone is, ultimate, like basically on top of each other in the center midfield. The Sounders did a good job, I thought, of pressing, of creating a high line, of being proactive defensively. And they really dominated the pitch. Like they dominated every part of the pitch except for the area right in front of the LAFC goal, which is sort of how you imagine. But LAFC yet it seemed like LAFC wasn't in control of the game. Like they were able to get out of pressure when they really needed to. They were able to, they only took 6 shots, but 4 of those shots were really dangerous shots. One of them, Stephen Fry came up on a big save. But they just seemed to play their game. The game plan just worked out just about perfectly for them. And it all stems, I think, from that early penalty where the Sounders get unbalanced. They end up creating sort of LAFC is able to create some chaos. And then, Nuhu gets a fair amount of blame. I think he deserves a fair amount of blame. He did flop on the ball for unknown reasons. But it's a penalty nonetheless. And that really set I don't want to say the game was unwinnable at that point, but it certainly put the Sounders behind the 8 ball and it allowed LAFC to essentially dictate the terms of the game.
Yeah, the thing that it did, the thing that the penalty did was allow LAFC exactly what they want. Was they didn't want the ball. They wanted to kind of sit in their shell. And basically their entire thing was, we've got this like really, really good fast guy in Denny Bouanga, and hopefully he can kind of do something. And pretty much on all 3 goals, he was like deeply involved in that aspect. So even with that shot that went, that their second goal, with the Stephen Fry thing, he was kind of involved there. So, but LAFC is kind of coming off a really tricky schedule, just like kind of the Sounders are in a similar sense, where pretty much they've had 2 games a week pretty much since the beginning of July, just like the Sounders have. And last week they got beat pretty handily at home against Columbus, which was like embarrassing. Their fans booed them off the field and stuff like that. And then
that part.
What?
I missed that. I didn't realize
I don't want to say anything that'll get me in trouble, but LAFC fans are.
I hear you. Yeah.
And then they played RSL in the middle of the week, got a 1-1 draw, and then they had to travel to Seattle, which we, as a kind of a Sounders biased podcast, would like to think it's a difficult place to travel to. And they got 4 points out of those 3 games, which they probably didn't get those points in the order that they wanted them, but They got them. And that's what you do when you're a good team and you have a hard week, is you just get the points. So, and they also are dealing with like international absences and injuries and stuff. So they wanted to come into this game and basically be like the classic, oh, we'll play for a draw.
Right.
And the Sounders effectively gifted them a 2-goal lead before halftime.
Oh.
And it's just like, okay, cool, great. Now you guys go figure out what you want to do. We're just going to hang out back here.
Right.
And that's exactly what happened.
Well, I'll tell you, how much does this impact your confidence? This is a month away now. A lot can change. but does the Open Cup semifinal, does this impact your confidence of that game? And do you feel like, regardless of what happens in that game, it will change anything in terms of how you feel about the Sounders' ability to match up with LAFC?
I don't know. I really don't know. Like, what I definitely know is I don't want the Sounders to really like put way too much into the Leagues Cup at this point, because at like right on the other side of the Leagues Cup is a game against Minnesota, which is now you're now back. You're in the conversation of battling Minnesota for playoff position. So even though that game's on the road and it's right before the semifinal, you have to take that really seriously. And then also LAFC is probably one of the teams that are going to do something in Leagues Cup. Like their group situation is fairly easy. And then they hold all the cards in the situation. And what I wanted from Saturday night's game was like, I wanted to show them something like a boxer going round by round.
Yeah, we showed them nothing.
It was just like instant knockout.
Yeah, I mean, I think like I said, I don't think there's a 3-0 gap between the Sounders and LAFC, but nothing that the Sounders did in that game makes LAFC second guess themselves at all. And you're right. I think, like, to me, I guess maybe this maybe transitions into our discussion about Leagues Cup and kind of the next month, what we want to see. But personally, I think the almost ideal situation for the Sounders is they win their group stage games, because you want to win group stage games. Maybe you win your round of 32 game, and then I'm fine. Like, if you get knocked out of the round of 16, that's totally fine. Like, I probably won't love it and in real time, but it would give the Sounders 4 chances to try to figure out their best 11, which I think is going to be a pretty important thing for them to start figuring out soon. And which, by the way, the LAFC gave us zero idea of what it is. And then, but they'd also get some time to rest and maybe take a little bit of, R&R and come back rested and ready to go for what is going to be a pretty busy stretch run. They have at least 10 games, maybe 11 games to play over the last, couple months of the season. And it's going to be a slog a little bit. And I think they need to put everything they can into Open Cup.
Yeah, I agree. I think last year is such like a spooky mirror of the situation. It's a pretty foggy mirror because it's not necessarily the same, but the vibes last summer around the Sounders weren't incredible.
No, they're awful.
Yeah, but they if you kind of go and compare, they were better statistically than where they're at right now.
Right. But they were in the middle of a bad slump.
Yeah. Where I think this team has come out of a slump. They go into Leagues Cup last year and would have been better to forfeit both of those games than to do what they did in both of those games.
Right.
Which is insane to say, because who cares about Leagues Cup really? But they somehow managed to go into Leagues Cup with the ability to break out of a bad slump, and they made it worse. The team doesn't play for 3 weeks, and then they make it even worse with a performance against Atlanta. All of that to say is I want them to at least learn from what happened last year, that Leagues Cup can actually seemingly your performance in that competition can make your vibes worse. So just don't do that. And whatever not doing that is, that's the acceptable bar I have for this competition. Especially don't go 2 up against Monterrey and then lose 4-2. That's what happened, right?
Yeah.
Something like that. And don't get like red cards and stuff because that's just confusing. But do like really kind of use this as like a mid-season friendly tournament to make some really hard decisions. Like if everybody's healthy, should certain players be starting? And I think like you gotta start looking at, and I know Josh Atencia isn't physically going to be here, but you got to figure out like what's the midfield pairing behind Rusnak? What's the position of the winger? Like who's playing what winger position, and who's playing fullback? You have like 6 positions you got to figure out in order to figure out your best 11. And I don't know if you can do that between now and a semifinal against LAFC.
It's going to be complicated. Just for the sake of closing the loop on this, I looked at the Sounders' position at Leagues Cup break last year. They had played 1 fewer games, but they were in 4th. So they were on 36 points through 24 games with a +6 goal difference. This year they're on 37 points through 25 games with a +5 goal difference. So maybe a little better, but pretty remarkable how similar.
But they're in 7th, right?
But they're in 7th. Yeah, they're in 7th, but they're only they're pretty close to well, I guess now they're 4 points out of 4th. So and RSL or Carlisle has also played an extra game, but whatever.
You know what they didn't do last summer? They didn't sign anybody.
They didn't. It sure would be nice if they went out and signed somebody. I will say this: the Sounders have scored 5 more goals at this point in the season than they had last year. So we'll take that.
Sure.
But yeah, it's there are big questions, I think, about the starting lineup. And I will say this, I appreciated the thought process that went into the starting lineup against LAFC, because I think it was designed around the idea of how do we get the most dynamic players on our team on the field together in a way that makes some sense. And I think it made sense to try to pair up Christian Roldan and Pedro de la Vega on the right. It didn't work. I'll be really honest. That was maybe the biggest disaster there was. I think it makes some sense to try to put Nuhu and Reed Baker Whiting on the left-hand side. And the rest of it, I think, all sort of kind of decides. It's like it was all the rest was basically chalk, for lack of a better term. But I think one of the things that was exposed in this game is Christian Roldan is a dynamic player going forward, but he can really he is not as technically and defensively sound as Alex at right back. And that was pretty apparent, I thought, on the first goal, where he got turned basically twice and ends up looking like a bit of a mess. And then he wasn't really able to get as involved as you need him to be going forward to sort of offset his defensive deficiencies.
Yeah, he did. He got roasted, as the kids say, on the first goal. But that doesn't end up being a goal if like the players around Stephen Fry,
right,
Nuhu in particular, just like lets the goalkeeper use his hands to pick up the ball.
Yeah.
I mean, like the initial shot was a little like funky and weird. It was the aftermath of the shot that caused the calamity that happened.
Thank you for listening to the Sounder at Heart Podcast Network, which now includes Nos Arietes, Lobbing Scorchers, and the Cooler Guild. We've been independent since August of 2023, but need your support to make sure it continues. Although this podcast is free, it's only made possible by your continued support. Memberships start as low as $25 a year, which not only helps make podcasts like this one happen, but also gets you access to everything we produce. If you're able to support us at higher levels, starting at $75 a year, you gain access to a host of other perks, most notably entry into our members-only Discord, where the smartest, funniest, and most engaged commenters share their thoughts and ideas. To find out more, just visit sounderatheart.com and click the subscribe button in the top right corner. Thanks for listening.
So Yeah, like I, I suppose I should be careful with what I say, but uh, like I like really kind of disagree with some of the thought processes that went into the lineup. Um, I could have I'm going to sound like a smartass, but I could have told you LAFC was going to come in with a back five. I don't think the Sounders were prepared for that. Quite frankly, I think they were sort of like, "Oh, it's LAFC. They're going to do what they always do. They're going to play their 4-3-3." I could have told you that given the week that they were having, they were going to kind of completely rip up the playbook and try to get.
I should add here, they have only played a back five one other time this season.
Yeah.
So I don't think it's entirely fair to say it was quite that obvious. And the other time they used it wasn't even on a short week.
Okay. Again, like I said, I already called myself out on this, but they seemed so unprepared for that.
They did, yeah. They did.
And even kind of setting that aside, I don't think you should have. I would have played musical chairs with the three positions you just talked about. I would have put. I thought Pedro should have played on the left, and Pedro de la Vega should have been the one that paired with Nuhu, because you effectively absolve Nuhu of offensive responsibility, which is a really good thing to do. And you then give De La Vega so much freedom to go be impactful, especially because Jordan Morris wants to pull off to the left, as he always does when he plays striker. So you kind of put a dynamic triangle on that side of the field between Rusnak, Morris, and De La Vega. And then you just kind of I think you play Roldan at right mid and Reed Baker Whiting at right back. And
that's a decent thought.
You have like a very structured right side there. All of that to say, I of course sound like a genius because they lost 3-0 and the right side is what falls apart. But that's kind of like besides the entire point I'm trying to make, which is like you still don't really know where some of your best pieces should play. And that's like really frustrating to watch. And then is like, should we even be considering like Pedro de la Vega's fitness at this point? Because it's like it looks like a problem at this point where like it, or is that just was that Smetcher's kind of covered, be like, it's 2-0 at halftime, we're not winning this game, we got to yank them anyways?
Well, I mean, I think they are being, I think what the situation with Pedro's fitness, I think is relatively straightforward, although that doesn't mean it's not concerning. I think they are so worried about what happened during the first few months of the season where he got hurt and then got hurt and then got hurt and then got hurt, that they're practicing an extreme level of caution in terms of allowing him to exert himself. And this is what I said at halftime. I thought he was going to get pulled because the game was being played at a much more dynamic pace than I think they had. Like he had, in a perfect world, he would have played probably 60, 65 minutes. But I think he had done enough exertion. He had covered enough ground that I could just tell by watching it that they weren't going to let him come out in the second half because he probably only had 5 or 10 minutes left in him. And at that point, it's like, why bother risking it? And so it's a concern, I think, to the degree that, man, you would like your young designated player to be able to play 90 minutes at this point. But, I would think, ideal world, that's where he'll be when they come out of Leagues Cup.
Yeah, I think my point wasn't necessarily like so much squared on his shoulders and like his fitness, which I know a lot of people want to talk about, like, oh, he spent all this money on this guy, how come he can't play yet? Like, given the context which this exists in, like it makes sense, but it's the options that you have to go to if he can't play.
Right.
And that's the main thing where I'm like, how have we like not done something around here. Like Paul Rothrock is an exciting player and it's like maybe one of the only bright spots this season. But like, really? Or is that who we want to be relying on in these moments? And Leo Chu doesn't even like play. He doesn't play in this game.
He literally didn't play.
and they didn't even use all their subs. So it's
no,
like
they did use all their subs.
I thought they only used 4 subs.
Well, I don't want to trip you up. I will fact check this, but
okay,
go ahead.
Sorry. Maybe they used all their windows. I'm not sure, but it's like it's this like broader thing where like we end up having these conversations about all these players this season. Alex Roldan, João Paulo's partner, and now maybe we're actually going to have a conversation about João Paulo as like a community. I don't know. We're having these conversations about Pedro de la Vega's injury, Raul Ruiz Diaz, Nuhu, whatever. But it's like the alternatives on this roster just aren't providing much confidence to kind of shield some of these players from the criticisms they're getting. So that's the
by the way, you were 100% right. They not only did they leave a sub, but they actually had a sub window. So Leo Chu's not being used is even more glaring, I suppose, than it would otherwise be. But yeah, I mean, it was, and I guess if I'm to, they looked okay, I thought, in the second half. Like overall, I think the second half they were playing at their pace. I think that the game opened up a little bit, especially in the first 20 minutes of the second half, and it did look like there was a chance for them to get back into the game, which frankly came around the same time that the Paul Rothrock penalty or non-penalty happened. I just watched Andrew Weeby's take on this on instant replay, and I think I basically agree with it, which is there was contact, and I actually had a chance to ask Alan Chapman that exact question. I basically said, there was contact, why was there no penalty? And he said he didn't think there was enough contact, and he embellished the foul. Personally, what frustrates me about that situation is not that it would have changed the result, although who knows what happens if they get that penalty and they convert it and it's 2-1 with 30 minutes left or whatever. But what frustrates me more is that we have seen that call in a Sounders game on VAR when that was almost the exact same play that Albert Rusnak got a penalty for against Montreal, which I think everyone agreed was a stone cold penalty. I don't really see how a defender is allowed to kick a attacking player, completely miss the ball, and then not have to face a penalty for it. I don't quite get that. I don't understand why the VAR didn't check it. If I'm VAR, I flag it immediately. I say, this should be reviewed for a penalty. And at that point, if Alan Chapman really wants to stick it, if he wants to stick by his, that's not enough contact for a penalty. He has that option, but at the very least, he needs to resend that yellow card because
I think
that's ridiculous.
I think he like completely biffed that moment. Personally, I think it's a penalty, should be awarded. But to like set the precedent in that situation that we have to prove he doesn't dive, which is like an insane thing, and then also prove that the defender had committed enough contact for a foul. I think from the VAR's perspective, it's like, he's like really staunchly dug himself in all the way over here. It's kind of one of those situations where I feel like if like after the game, those two guys talk to each other, it's going to be like, yeah, that's probably a mistake. And who knows, maybe Pro will actually admit something like that. But I think it's because Chapman was so convinced right away that it was embellishment that to walk all that back is hard for them to do. Not actually, but
from a practice, ego management perspective, I see what you're saying.
And then that it would throw Alan Chapman's brain for a loop, which maybe that should happen, but he thought he saw something, he made a decision, hopefully the VAR tried to convince him otherwise, but I don't know. I just feel like if he's not so convinced that Rothrock dove, then we're having a different conversation. And I also think we're having a different conversation if the Sounders had like a better head on their shoulders the entire game.
Right.
Especially around that first penalty. Like I think Alan Chapman's refereeing a context that he thinks one of the teams is like insane. He was refereeing that game thinking that the Sounders have lost their head and I have to pay attention to that.
Yeah, you know, that's an interesting piece of context there, because I think there was the penalty that he called, which I think in real time to me looks like a stone cold penalty. And so that there's arguments. I mean, there's always going to be arguments, but I think honestly, I'm not 100% sure why it was reviewed. I am actually genuinely curious to see what the Inside Video Review, which is Pro's video, which usually talks about plays that were reviewed. So this play will hopefully be talked about in that video. I'm still confused as to why VAR recommended a review there. I don't know if it was because it was potentially a red card, which I would have frankly not liked, but probably could have understood, or if they were saying he didn't touch it, which I think is wrong. He very clearly touched it with his hand. Or B, like the other possibility is that maybe they thought that Nuhu was knocked over, and so maybe that would have absolved that, you know, that would have absolved the penalty. I meant originally I had a question that I had submitted to ask about that, but I thought better of it because it was ultimately immaterial, I thought, because I thought ultimately the right choice was made. But that's context for the Sounders then tried to get they were doing the whole like raising. They really seemed dead set on trying to get a penalty. There was a couple plays in the first half where there were close calls on handballs, one of which did hit Chanot's hand, which is kind of funny.
Yeah.
I think it was fairly waved off, but there was one instance where it did hit his hand, but there was a couple other instances like that. And then weirdly, I think Chanot winning that tackle on Morris also influences Chapman's willingness to call the next penalty.
Yeah, because he's not like Rothrock's not in a necessarily dangerous area. It's not like he can from that position, like maybe he gets a cross off. And I'm having a really hard time remembering what's happening anywhere else. So I don't even think there's a runner to get the ball to, because Morris had just been tackled. So maybe he like the only thing that Rothrock can do there is win a penalty. I think he does, but maybe Chapman's like sick of these guys, basically.
Right. I
do
think
annoying
that's
him for an hour and a half at this point.
I do actually think that is. I do think there is an element of that he was sort of like, "Hey guys, I'm not bailing you out of this one."
Yeah,
like,
and like, and it is not helpful to talk about it in these scenarios. But if it's like 1-1, maybe he thinks differently. But I definitely think like, from the context of the match, the Sounders were incredibly whiny up until that point. Maybe you are a person that think that's like coming from a place of like injustice and they deserve to be whiny, and maybe you just hate all referees. But I like can kind of understand. I'm like not that bothered. I guess I'm just like ultimately not that bothered that wasn't called a penalty. I just kind of really wish the yellow card for embellishment wasn't part of the conversation, because that just feels very like, come on, man.
Right. Yeah, that definitely felt like a little insult to injury type of situation. But you know, I guess that sort of does, you know, the other thing that you mentioned as an open question that I think was fairly that I think is fair to wonder about, especially after this game, is João Paulo's place in the starting lineup. And when he, you know, up until, you know, what's funny is like I have been basically working on a story that was talking about how he's had this resurgence. I'm glad I hadn't written it yet, because I think it definitely has a different angle now. But he had been so good for like the last 6 weeks.
Yeah.
He looked like his old self. But then he was basically invisible in this game. And he sort of reminded us of how he looked at the beginning of the season when he was really struggling for fitness and he was just generally not the player that we were used to. And I think that's the problem right now with João Paulo, is that he is capable of being his old self, but he's not reliably capable of being his old self. You never know when he's going to be that player.
And you kind of need to manage, you ideally would want to manage that situation so that you could decide, like, we need you to be your old self against LAFC. You don't need to be your old self in the 3 games before that.
In St. Louis.
Yeah. Well, he came off the bench.
Playing St. Louis.
But like he was like great against Austin, I thought. So it's like, do you really need João Paulo to be great against to win 1-0 against Austin FC? Probably. Well, ideally, no, but this particular team does need that. So it's just kind of like he's these are almost the same exact conversations we had about the end of Ozzy's time here, where it's like
very similar.
Completely different types of players. They wear the same number though, where it's like
similar, vaguely similar roles too.
Same position. They play it differently. They wear the same number.
Yeah.
They will go down in history as Sounders legends. All of that's the same.
Yeah.
But it's kind of like we had Gustav Svensson when Ozzy's decline was happening. So it's kind of like that was managed way better. There's just nothing there in midfield, like Danny Leyva to.
I don't think they have. I think both Josh and Obed are very good partners for JP. They have not yet shown that they're great partners for each other, and
that's worrisome.
that is worrisome. That there's a problem there. I suppose maybe Christian Roldan could fit in there, but he is another player who I think is, I think you could argue that Leyva, Rusnak, Roldan, Vargas, and Atencio are all perfectly capable to very good central midfielders, but none of them are really sixes, and they all sort of need someone else to be the six to be their best. And so I almost wonder if the Sounders' biggest priority, whether it be now or in the offseason, might be going out and getting a six. I would love to bring JP back, as long as you could bring him back sort of as a part-time player and you're not paying him to be an automatic starter. But that does lead into the next big question, which is over the next month, in addition to the Leagues Cup, this is the Sounders' last real chance to add any talent. I have reported on this quite a bit, but all indications that I've gotten is that they aren't going to make a big signing. They might make a notable signing, but they're not going to sign a DP level player. To do that, they would probably have to buy out Raul Ruidiaz. There's no indication that I've gotten that they're thinking about doing that. They tried to sign this guy, Špicic from Croatia. That fell through because he wanted too much money and they didn't have the cap space to get him under the cap. But that sort of left them trying to figure out what they're going to do. What do you like? Philosophically, where do you fall? I want them to sign someone because I feel like they just can't sit out a third straight summer transfer window. And there is like an optical element to that. Mm-hmm. And they need to find someone that is worth signing. I just don't, I feel like they have to start with, we need to sign someone, and then the chips fall where they fall. But I don't know necessarily which position they most need. Where do you fall on that? Would you be okay with them sitting this out if they really feel like they can't improve the top end of the roster?
No, I wouldn't be okay with that, because I think you can improve the middle tier of the roster with the available kind of budget they have. And ideally, they would be doing that at some point anyways. So you kind of, you're getting a lot of answers about players who are not going to be playing on your team next year. Raul Ruidiaz, maybe Leo Chu, hopefully, like maybe something's happening there. So there's two positions where it's like the guy that we're going to be using in this role, now, don't necessarily think about like Raul Rui Diaz, DP, number 9. It's backup striker is the role that Raul Rui Diaz is playing, which is a waste of resource, but hey, it's where we're at. So it's like, okay, we've gotten an answer about Jordan Morris. Playing him in his best position is really good. And we should probably, if we're going to have Jordan Morris on the roster, plan to have him in this position. So we need a sort of like a dynamic option behind him. So maybe go find that. Or you have kind of like beneath your starting wingers outside of Reed Baker Whiting, you have not a whole lot to work with there. So maybe you target a TAM Victor Rodriguez type player that can start in certain games or come off the bench and do there. Or you also can, like you said, target the midfield. Like number 6s aren't that expensive in this league comparative to other places in the roster. So maybe you'd go and find that Gustav Svensson again. Like maybe not literally him because he's probably not very good anymore. But you just you have so many options, and you're kind of like you're at a point where you're putting together a new puzzle. You got to start somewhere. You have to, and you can start in a certain quadrant if you want to, if those are the pieces that are in front of you. And I'm hesitant to be annoyed at this point because I don't know what the end result's going to be.
Yeah.
But you look at other teams around them in the Western Conference, they had a signing or multiple signings done before the window opened.
Or at least we're ready to announce as soon as the window opened.
Yeah. And Austin FC is perfect example. They had 2 guys that they debuted before the game that the Sounders played there. And that was a week before the window opened.
Right.
So it's and I don't know anything about those guys. They might be the worst players in MLS history. I don't know. But it was still kind of the thought that counts, I guess. So maybe they're holding out for somebody towards the end of this window. But if you kind of look what's going on, European teams are already starting their training camps. They're starting their preseason tours. Their rosters are getting pretty much set. Further down the list, you've got teams already playing in European qualifiers, like the Europa League and Conference League. And so the level of player that they can get at the budget that they're at from those types of teams, it's going to be harder and harder because they're already planning for their season. And it seems like it would have been easier to do this 2 months ago.
Yeah. I mean, I know that there's some issues about figuring out their budget and what they're willing to spend out of pocket. And I think that's creating some of the problems, but I agree with you. It feels like they should have had something lined up and ready to go. I don't know exactly why that wasn't the case. I would imagine it's not for lack of effort, but
sure. Yeah,
you're right. I think that once you're getting to the point now where if you're signing someone from Europe, you're talking about someone who has very few options, and that's not exactly the kind of player you expect to be a difference maker in MLS in 2024. I agree with you that a Victor Rodriguez type is probably the ceiling of what they can try to do. And that would be, that's sort of what I was hoping Dario Špikic was going to be, which was sort of a player who isn't maybe an automatic starter, but is someone who you are going to consider starting in a big game. And that's I don't know how likely that is to happen at this point. I'm holding out hope. I don't want to be too harsh until we see what actually happens, but it is immensely frustrating to be looking at a transfer window that might close without the Sounders making any real move. And we know they have some salary cap flexibility. I don't necessarily want to call it salary cap space because I'm sure on paper they can fill up all their space, but they have the ability to sign someone, and it would be really frustrating for them not to do it. Maybe I don't know. I know that they're probably looking at trades within MLS. We'll see.
Yeah,
but
yeah. I mean, I think a month and a half ago, we had this conversation.
Yeah,
Like,
probably.
maybe even the last time I was on, but
Right.
It's just kind of like, it's not clear what plan A is. So you have no idea what the fallback plans are. And I know that they're very protective about kind of the perception of what's going on in terms of like transfers. So they're not necessarily going to be like some other teams in MLS that put out the targets that they want through Tom Bogert and then like fall through and their fans get mad about that. But well, maybe that's a thing that should be revisited, because like we don't know what's going on, and it's the unease of like,
well, yes, I agree.
Like you're like, they are putting out information that they are active, but it's been so long we don't know what that means. And is that just like I'm gonna kind of go out in left field here and say like, here's my base level of acceptable move for where they're at right now, and that's trading for Jeremy Abobasi. I think that like that's something that they could do.
An interesting move.
And that's my level of acceptable for this window. And and if you were to ask me if that's something I think the Sounders will do, I don't think they will. And that's frustrating to me.
Yeah. I mean, I think you would file him under sort of distressed asset right now, a player who once was pretty good, who has some upside, but who has not been who is sort of snake bit this year. You know, I think the pessimist could argue, well, you're just you're slightly upgrading over Danny Musovski at this point. But, you know, I do think it would at least show some intent to be getting better. And as a baseline of acceptability, I could talk myself into that one.
It is something. He can play 3 positions that you need him to play. Maybe not super well, but he's better than Danny Musovski, and he also can kind of change some dynamics of relationships with other players, which I think is really important, because I think you could play him with Raul Ruidiaz and it'd be more interesting than any combination of player that Raul Ruidiaz can play with currently. And yeah, he's on maybe the worst team in MLS history. And he used to play for Portland, so I think it'd be kind of fun if he scored against them for us.
Yeah, there you go. That's good. Well, I think we've exhausted what I had to talk about. I am sort of looking forward to Leagues Cup only in the sense that it gives me a little bit of a mental break. Like, I don't feel like I am as emotionally invested in the Sounders' performance in these 2 games. Of course, I said that about the last Leagues Cup, and then I ended up getting really frustrated about how that went. So, you know, it's all relative. But Mark, thank you so much for hanging out with me today. At some point, we're going to have Aaron back on. But, you know, in the meantime, we'll take you.
In the meantime, you just get exhausted by talking to me, which is what you just said.
I don't think I said that.
No, I'm just teasing you.
I got it. Well, thank you so much. I will say we're closing in on our 1-year anniversary for Sounder at Heart. And I just wanted to remind everyone that's listening to this that if you haven't checked up on your subscription status, now is a good time to do that. Also, make sure that you have a good credit card in the system, so that, you know, if you want to renew automatically, it will actually go through. And yeah, the first year has been amazing on Sounder at Heart. We had over 5,000 members. About half of those members are paying members. It's been really successful. We've been able to produce a lot of great content, and I hope everyone is as thrilled about it as I am, and they want to continue to support this, because without your support, we don't work. So I just wanted to put that out there into the world and say both thank you and ask you humbly to resubscribe as well. But with all that said, I wanted to thank our sponsor, Full Pool Wines, as well as our producer, Lickett. Of course, Mark Kastner. I am Jeremiah Shan. This is Nos Audietis. Remember, you'll never get alone.
We love you. Let's win another one!